golden light settles across the Mediterranean around 1200 BC in the height of the Late Bronze Age. A world of metals and monarchs where copper and tin forge armies, and gold moves across seas as easily as grain. Palaces rise above busy harbours, chariots roll through dry valleys, bearing tribute to kings whose scribes record every exchange and every alliance in neat lines of script. This is the age of great powers. Hittite armies guarding Anatolia, pharaohs ruling the Nile, Mycenaean kings commanding warriors across the Aegean, and the dynasties of Mesopotamia shaping trade and tribute far to the east. Their world feels unshakable, a web of empires bound by commerce, treaties, and centuries of rule. But within a single generation, most of it is gone. The merchant ships burn in harbours that will lie empty for decades. The palaces where kings once corresponded across continents become ash-covered ruins where wild animals make their dens. No single account survives to tell the complete story. No archive preserves the correspondence that might reveal which kingdoms fell first and why. The Bronze Age collapse becomes history's greatest vanishing act, a world-spanning catastrophe that left behind only fragments and silence. What could erase such a powerful world so completely? Who decided which fragments of memory would survive to shape how future generations understood what had happened? Standing at the edge of these ancient mysteries, we confront a possibility that challenges everything we think we know about how civilizations fall. That the Bronze Age collapse may not have been history's greatest disaster, but its first successful cover-up. By the way, if this mystery already feels like something rarely discussed, please hit subscribe. We're just getting started, and some questions have been waiting a very long time to be asked. Along the northern coast of Syria, on the Mediterranean strip, the clay tablets lay scattered among the broken kilns, their surfaces still bearing the desperate impressions of fingers that had pressed too hard, too fast. Half-fired, never sent, they crumbled at the archaeologists' touch in 1929. But before they fell apart completely, someone managed to read the words scratched into their surface. Words that had waited over 3,000 years to deliver a message no one was left to receive. The tablets spoke of ships appearing on the horizon, of cities burning, of armies that had marched away and would never return home. This was Ugarit, and somewhere in those crumbling fragments lay the final testimony of a world that had simply stopped existing. For centuries before that terrible day, Ugarit had been the Venice of the Bronze Age, a gleaming port where ships from Egypt's delta docked alongside vessels bearing the royal seals of distant Hatti. Merchants from Mycenaean Greece haggled in the harbour, while Cypriot copper traders counted their profits in warehouses that stretched along the waterfront. This was the beating heart of an interconnected world, where kings wrote personal letters across vast distances and diplomatic marriages bound kingdoms together across hundreds of miles. The city's royal archives, discovered decades before those final tablets, painted a picture of wealth and sophistication that rivaled any kingdom of its age. The official records tell us this Bronze Age world was stable, ordered, and enduring. Egyptian chronicles documented centuries of peaceful correspondence with Ugarit's rulers. Hittite archives preserved thousands of tablets referencing the city's crucial role in imperial trade networks. Everything was recorded, catalogued, and preserved for posterity in the great libraries of the age. Yet when Ugarit met its end, those same meticulous record-keepers fell silent with chilling precision. None of them left any accounts of its destruction in their records. It wasn't just lost to time or accident. The silence felt coordinated, deliberate, as if the entire diplomatic establishment had received instructions to forget that Ugarit had ever existed. But memories have a way of surviving in places where official histories fear to tread. In the generations that followed, local inhabitants began to tell different stories, passed down in whispers around cooking fires and shared among fishermen by moonlight. They spoke of a city that had burned itself rather than surrender to mysterious enemies who came from the sea. Old women claimed that Ugarit's final king had ordered his own palace destroyed to prevent sacred treasures from falling into foreign hands. The most persistent legend held that the site itself was cursed, that anyone who tried to rebuild where Ugarit had stood would meet the same fate as the original inhabitants. For over a millennium after Ugarit's destruction, no one attempted to establish a permanent settlement on the ruins. The land sat empty, its fertile fields unused, and its natural harbour, one of the finest on the eastern Mediterranean coast, left to silt up with sand and thyme. Sailors passing the abandoned harbour reported an unnatural stillness. Local fishermen would cross themselves when their nets drifted too close to the ruins, muttering prayers to ward off whatever presence still lingered there. Even more strangely, the neighbouring cities that survived the Bronze Age collapse maintained an odd, collective amnesia about Ugarit's final days. It wasn't just that they didn't know what had happened. It was as if they had actively chosen not to remember. When archaeologists finally excavated the site in the 20th century, they uncovered evidence that challenged both the official silence and the folk tales. The physical remains told a story more complex and more disturbing than either version suggested. Scattered human bones lay throughout the city, but their positions revealed something unexpected. These weren't the remains of defenders who had died fighting at the walls or civilians who had perished in their homes during a siege. Instead, the skeletons suggested people who had been caught completely off guard. Merchants who had died in their warehouses, scribes who had collapsed over their writing tables, even children found in places where no child should have been during a battle. The city's massive defensive walls showed no signs of siege warfare. No piles of arrowheads marked desperate last stands at the gates. No hastily buried caches of treasure suggested a population preparing for a long siege. The archaeological evidence pointed to systematic abandonment followed by deliberate, methodical destruction. In the harbour, archaeologists found the charred remains of dozens of ships, but they weren't warships burned in naval combat. They were merchant vessels, some still loaded with cargo that would never reach its destination. The ships had been torched while at anchor, their crews and cargo consumed by flames that someone had lit intentionally. Foreign wood fragments scattered throughout the ruins proved that ships from distant lands had been present when the city died. But analysis revealed something unexpected. The wood came from merchant vessels, not warships. Some fragments even showed evidence of repeated repairs, suggesting these were old, familiar ships that had visited Ugarit's harbour many times before. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been a surprise attack by unknown raiders. Most troubling of all were the discoveries in the royal quarter. Cuneiform tablets had been gathered into careful piles and burned, their scripts partially melted, but still readable enough to reveal they contained diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and administrative records. Someone had taken the time to collect these documents systematically before destroying them. This wasn't the random destruction of conquest and mob, it was the methodical erasure of evidence. Among the tablets that escaped complete destruction was one that provided a glimpse into Ugarit's final hours. Written by King Amurapi to his ally, the ruler of Alashia, the island we now call Cyprus, it preserved what may be the last coherent words of a dying civilization. My father, now the ships of the enemy have been coming. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all of my infantry and chariots are stationed in Hatti, and that all my ships are stationed in the land of Lucca? Now the 7 ships of the enemy which have been coming have done harm to us. Now if other ships of the enemy turn up, Send me a report somehow so that I will know. Just 7 enemy vessels had been enough to bring the Mediterranean's greatest trading hub to its knees. The king's army was gone, deployed to fight in foreign wars. His navy was stationed elsewhere, defending distant allies. Ugarit, for all its wealth and connections, had been left defenseless at precisely the moment when defense mattered most. But the tablet revealed details that were even more unsettling than the military situation. King Amurapi doesn't identify these enemies by name, suggesting that his correspondent on Cyprus should already know who they are. He mentions that his forces are deployed to specific locations, Hatti and the land of Lucca, but doesn't explain why such deployments were necessary. Most strangely of all, he asks for reports of additional enemy ships, implying some kind of coordinated surveillance network between allied kingdoms. These aren't the words of a king facing an unknown threat from mysterious raiders. These are the words of someone who knows exactly what's happening, but cannot, or dare not, name it directly in official correspondence. The tablet never reached its destination. No response was ever recorded, and when archaeologists searched for corresponding records in Cyprus, they found that the island's Bronze Age archives had suffered an identical fate, destroyed in fires that seemed designed to erase entire libraries of diplomatic correspondence. The same pattern appeared across the eastern Mediterranean. Wherever Ugarit had maintained diplomatic relations, official records suddenly stopped mentioning the city, as if an entire network of kingdoms had simultaneously developed amnesia about one of their most important trading partners. If Ugarit, one of the Mediterranean's most connected, most powerful, most thoroughly documented cities, could vanish from history with barely a trace, what else might have disappeared without our knowledge? If attackers could coordinate the systematic burning of archives across multiple kingdoms, erasing evidence of their identities from locations hundreds of miles apart, then the Bronze Age collapse might not be the story of random destruction by mysterious sea peoples. It might be the story of the world's first successful information war, a campaign fought not just with bronze weapons, but with the deliberate cultivation of amnesia. And if that's true, then the greatest mystery isn't who these attackers were, but who they became afterward, and why they needed the world to forget where they came from. In the shadow of Medinet Habu Temple, carved stone warriors march across walls that have witnessed 30 centuries of desert wind. Unlike the broken tablets of Ugarit that carried no final testimony, these hieroglyphs spell out victory in every line. Ramesses III, defender of Egypt, crusher of the sea peoples, savior of civilization itself. But as shadows shift across the ancient reliefs in the failing light, a question emerges from the stone silence. If this was truly such a glorious triumph, why does the victory feel so much like an ending? The carvings at Medinet Habu tell Egypt's version of events with the confidence of absolute power. In 1177 BC, mysterious invaders swept down from the north, bringing destruction to every kingdom in their path. Cities burned from Anatolia to the Levant. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's greatest rival, simply vanished from history. Mycenaean palaces across Greece fell to ash and ruin. Babylon teetered on the edge of collapse, but Egypt stood firm. Ramesses III, the texts proclaim, built a wall of ships and spears across the Nile Delta. His archers rained death from the riverbanks while his navy cut the invaders' vessels to pieces in the sacred waters. The pharaoh himself led the charge, his divine power breaking the backs of enemies who had seemed unstoppable. Egypt alone survived what the historians would later call the Bronze Age collapse. The reliefs show sea peoples in elaborate detail, some wearing horned helmets, others with feathered crests, their foreign weapons, strange and savage, compared to Egypt's disciplined bronze. Their ships burn in the Nile while Egyptian soldiers count the severed hands of the dead, each one a trophy of divine justice. The hieroglyphic inscriptions boast of captured prisoners, of families torn from their homelands and brought in chains to serve the eternal glory of Egypt. This is the story Egypt wanted the world to remember. But 30 centuries later, other evidence whispers different truths. The same decades that saw Ramesses III's supposed triumph also witnessed devastating changes across the eastern Mediterranean that Egypt's official chroniclers somehow forgot to mention. Pollen samples from lake beds reveal agricultural collapse on a scale not seen for centuries. Tree rings show drought conditions that lasted for generations. Seismic data confirms earthquake storms that shattered cities from Turkey to Palestine. Yet Egypt's version of events treats these catastrophes as background noise to their military glory. The texts acknowledge that other kingdoms suffered, but only to highlight Egypt's superior strength. The Hittites fell because they were weak. The Mycenaeans collapsed because they lacked divine protection. Babylon crumbled because the gods favored Egypt alone. But if Egypt was truly unaffected by the disasters that destroyed its neighbors, why do Egyptian grain stores from this period show signs of severe rationing? Why do papyrus records mention emergency food distributions to cities across the kingdom? Why do tax records reveal settlements abandoned along trade routes that had functioned for centuries? The archaeological evidence tells a more complex story than the triumphant carvings suggest. Egyptian cities from this period show clear signs of population decline. The elaborate tomb paintings that had defined Egyptian art for over a millennium become simpler, cheaper, less sophisticated. Even in the royal tombs, the quality of craftsmanship begins to deteriorate. Most tellingly, the great trading networks that had made Egypt wealthy start to fray and break. Copper from Cyprus becomes rare in Egyptian workshops. Tin from distant Afghanistan disappears entirely from royal inventories. Cedar wood from Lebanon, so crucial to Egyptian shipbuilding that its absence would cripple the navy, appears less and less frequently in construction projects. If Egypt had truly defeated the Sea Peoples in a decisive battle, why were the economic foundations of the kingdom crumbling even as the pharaoh carved his victory monuments? The answer may lie in documents that Egypt's chroniclers preferred to bury in administrative archives rather than carve on temple walls. The Papyrus Harris, compiled during Ramesses III's reign, contains a puzzling passage about settling vanquished peoples in strongholds bound in his name. The pharaoh, it seems, didn't simply defeat the Sea Peoples. He invited some of them to stay. Other fragmentary records speak of foreign soldiers serving in Egyptian garrisons, of new settlements established along Egypt's borders, of northerners granted land in exchange for military service. These weren't the actions of a kingdom that had crushed its enemies completely. They were the desperate measures of a realm that needed new blood to survive. The hieroglyphic accounts speak of prisoners taken in battle, but administrative records reveal these same prisoners being granted fertile land along the Mediterranean coast. The temple carvings show foreign enemies humbled before the pharaoh's might, but papyrus documents describe negotiations, treaties, and careful diplomatic arrangements. Rather than crushing the Sea Peoples militarily, Egypt may have negotiated with them, trading land and resources for protection against the chaos consuming the rest of the Bronze Age world. The victory at the Nile Delta may have been less a battle than a settlement agreement, with Egypt offering the invaders what they wanted in exchange for stability. This would explain the paradox at the heart of Egypt's survival. While every other great power of the Bronze Age world collapsed completely, Egypt managed to maintain some semblance of order and continuity. But the price may have been transformation so fundamental that the Egypt of 1100 BC bore little resemblance to the empire of 1200 BC. Consider the timeline more carefully. The Sea People's attacks on Egypt occur precisely when the kingdom's traditional allies and enemies alike are falling into ruin. The Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's primary diplomatic partner for over a century, disappears from all records around 1180 BC. Greece, source of mercenaries and exotic goods, burns around the same time. Assyria retreats into its heartland, abandoning territories it had controlled for generations. In this context, Egypt's victory looks less like military triumph and more like successful adaptation to a collapsing world. While other kingdoms rigidly maintained their traditional structures until they shattered completely, Egypt may have proven flexible enough to absorb new populations, adopt new technologies, and restructure its society to survive in changed circumstances. The clues are scattered throughout the archaeological record. Egyptian metalworking techniques show sudden innovations during this period, innovations that match methods used in Anatolia and the Aegean. Egyptian ship designs evolve rapidly, incorporating features that appear to derive from Sea People's vessels. Even Egyptian military organization changes, with new units of foreign soldiers appearing in official records. But acknowledging this adaptation would have meant admitting that Egypt's traditional way of life was ending. Instead, the pharaoh's scribes crafted a narrative of unchanging strength, of divine protection that preserved Egypt exactly as it had always been. The carvings at Medinet Habu became not just propaganda for foreign consumption, but a way for Egypt itself to avoid confronting the magnitude of change it had undergone. The most poignant evidence of this transformation comes from the settlements established in what would later become Philistine territory. Archaeological excavations reveal communities that blend Egyptian administrative practices with Sea People's material culture. Egyptian-style buildings contain Aegean-type pottery. Traditional Egyptian religious symbols appear alongside foreign cult objects. These weren't conquered territories being forcibly Egyptianized. They were hybrid communities where Egyptian settlers and Sea People's refugees learned to live together, creating something new from the ruins of their separate worlds. The official narrative called them strongholds bound in the pharaoh's name, but the archaeological reality suggests voluntary cooperation between desperate peoples seeking survival in a collapsing world. The transformation went deeper than simple population mixing. Economic records show Egypt gradually abandoning its dependence on the old Bronze Age trade networks in favor of more localized production and exchange. The kingdom that had once imported goods from across the known world began to focus on what it could produce or obtain from nearby sources. Luxury items that had defined Egyptian elite culture for millennia became rare or disappeared entirely. Religious practices evolved as well. The elaborate temple complexes that had showcased Egypt's wealth and cosmic order received less investment and maintenance. Simpler, more localized religious observances became more common. Even the pharaoh's divine status seems to have been subtly redefined, with less emphasis on cosmic authority and more focus on practical leadership in difficult times. Through all these changes, Egypt's official narrative remained fixed on the moment of triumph at Medinet Habu. The scribes continued to copy and recopy the story of Ramesses III's great victory. This persistent mythology may have served a crucial psychological function. As long as Egyptians could point to the carvings at Medinet Habu and remember their ancestors' great victory, they could maintain the illusion that their civilization remained fundamentally unchanged. The alternative, acknowledging that they were living in a new world built on the ruins of the old, may have been too psychologically devastating to accept. The final irony is that Egypt's strategy may have worked too well. By successfully adapting to the Bronze Age collapse while maintaining the mythology of unchanging strength, the kingdom preserved enough continuity to survive into the Iron Age. But the very success of this adaptation made it impossible for later historians to understand what had really happened during those crucial decades around 1177 BC. As evening light fades across the reliefs at Medinet Habu, the carved pharaoh continues his eternal battle against enemies who died 3 millennia ago. The hieroglyphs still proclaim victory, but in the growing shadows, another story becomes visible. The story of a civilization that survived not through strength alone, but through the courage to change everything while pretending nothing had changed at all. Perhaps that is the most profound mystery of Egypt's survival. In a world where every other great power chose rigid adherence to tradition over adaptation, Egypt found a way to transform itself completely while maintaining the comforting fiction that it remained forever the same. The carvings at Medinet Habu may not record a military victory at all, but the first successful example of managed civilizational transition in human history. The question that lingers in the temple shadows is whether this was conscious strategy or fortunate accident. But one thing seems certain: the story carved in stone is not the story that actually happened. And perhaps that gap between official memory and hidden reality is itself the most important lesson Egypt has to teach about how civilizations survive when their worlds end. In the heart of Hattusa, beneath layers of ash and fallen stone, archaeologists found a room that had once contained the memory of an empire. The floor was littered with broken clay tablets, their cuneiform script scorched and cracked, scattered like the fragments of shattered thoughts. Some pieces bore the royal seal of the Hittite kings, others showed traces of diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, military orders. But none were complete. The fire that consumed them had been thorough, methodical, hot enough to crack stone and melt metal. Yet something about the destruction felt wrong. This wasn't the random burning of conquest where enemy soldiers torched whatever they found. Someone had gathered these tablets carefully and taken time to ensure that certain secrets would die with the flames. But who? What if the most powerful archive in the Bronze Age world hadn't been destroyed by foreign invaders at all? What if it had been burned by the empire's own hands? For over 4 centuries, Hattusa had stood as the unshakable center of the Hittite Empire, its massive stone walls rising from the Anatolian plateau like a challenge to heaven itself. The Hittites were meticulous record keepers, documenting every treaty, every tribute payment, every royal marriage alliance. Their archives contained detailed accounts of military campaigns, internal rebellions, natural disasters, and succession disputes. If anyone in the Bronze Age world left behind a complete record of their civilization's final moments, it should have been the Hittites. But when modern archaeologists searched for accounts of the empire's end, they found nothing. The last datable cuneiform tablets from Hattusa trail off around 1200 BC with routine administrative business. Tax assessments, grain distributions, religious calendar notations. Then silence. No military dispatches describing enemy movements. No royal decrees prepared the city for siege. The record simply stops as if the scribes had put down their styluses in the middle of an ordinary day and never picked them up again. For a civilization that had documented everything, this absence of final testimony was deafening. However, whispers of memory survived in the folk traditions of Anatolia and the Levant. Generations after Hattusa's destruction, storytellers would speak of a cursed city that had been abandoned by its own gods. They told of a place so proud that even in defeat, its people chose to destroy their home rather than let enemies claim it. The most persistent legends spoke of the ash-bearers, mysterious figures who appeared in mountain villages during the dark years following the collapse. These wanderers, according to the stories, carried nothing but pouches of ash, which they would scatter along roads and paths. Some tales claimed the ash-bearers were former priests of Hattusa, condemned to wander the earth until they had scattered the last remains of their sacred city to the winds. Others suggested they were royal guards, sworn to ensure that no trace of the empire's final secrets could ever be discovered. All stories agree on one detail: the ashes bearers were tasked with burying the last vestiges of Hittites. Whether these legends preserved genuine memories or were simply attempts to explain the inexplicable, they pointed toward a consistent theme. Hattusa's destruction had been different from the fate of other Bronze Age cities. It hadn't simply fallen, it had been deliberately erased. Modern archaeology began to support what the folk tales had long suggested. When excavations reached the deepest levels of destruction at Hattusa, they revealed evidence of burning unlike anything found at other Bronze Age sites. The ash layers were unusually thick and uniform, suggesting fires that had burned slowly and completely, rather than the quick conflagrations typical of military conquest. Chemical analysis of the ash revealed traces of cedar oil and pine resin, materials that would have been precious and carefully hoarded during the final crisis years of the Bronze Age. These weren't substances that would be wasted in random destruction. They were accelerants, used deliberately to ensure that fires burned hot enough and long enough to consume everything completely. Most telling was the distribution of the destruction. Enemy armies typically focused their efforts on walls, gates, and defensive structures, leaving administrative buildings for later looting. But at Hattusa, the most complete destruction occurred in the archive rooms and royal quarters, precisely the areas where the empire's most sensitive documents would have been stored. The defensive walls, by contrast, showed far less damage, as if the city's military infrastructure had been less important to the destroyers than its memory. Archaeological evidence also suggested that Hattusa's final population had been unusually small for such a massive city. Remains from the final occupation levels indicate that much of the urban area had already been abandoned before the fires began. This wasn't a bustling capital suddenly overwhelmed by invaders, but a largely empty shell whose remaining inhabitants had time to make careful decisions about what should survive and what should disappear forever. The pattern of abandonment followed logical lines of retreat. The outer districts were evacuated first, their valuables carefully removed, and their buildings left intact but empty. The administrative quarters were next, with clear evidence that important documents and royal regalia had been systematically gathered from scattered offices and brought to central locations. Only the innermost palace areas showed signs of continued occupation until the very end. This gradual concentration of people and materials toward the city's heart suggests a planned withdrawal rather than panicked flight. The final inhabitants of Hattusa had time to organize, to choose what was worth preserving and what needed to be destroyed. The question that haunts the archaeological evidence is, what did they decide was too dangerous to survive? Climate data from the period reveals the environmental pressures that the Hittite Empire faced during its final decades. Tree ring analysis shows a prolonged drought that began around 1250 BC and intensified through the following century. Pollen samples indicate widespread agricultural failure across the Anatolian plateau. Seismic records confirm a series of devastating earthquakes that struck the region during the same period. But the Hittites had survived droughts and earthquakes before. Their empire had endured for over 4 centuries, precisely because it was adaptable and resilient. The environmental crisis alone couldn't explain why this particular challenge proved fatal, or why the response involved such systematic destruction of records. The answer may lie in fragments of correspondence found at other sites throughout the former Hittite sphere of influence. Letters discovered in Syria and Palestine, dating to the empire's final years, reveal growing tensions between the central government and its vassal kingdoms. Local rulers who had once been loyal clients began asserting independence, withholding tribute, and forming alliances with each other rather than with Hattusa. More disturbing were hints of internal conspiracy among the Hittite nobility themselves. References appear to friends of the Western lands and those who remember the old agreements, cryptic phrases that suggest some members of the empire's elite were already planning for a future without imperial unity. If civil war or widespread rebellion was brewing within the empire, the systematic destruction of archives at Hattusa begins to make sense. The royal records would have contained evidence of secret negotiations, promises made to different factions, and perhaps details of planned betrayals that could never be allowed to surface. Better to burn everything than risk having such secrets discovered by rival claimants to power. The most tantalizing clue comes from a single tablet fragment found in the deepest ash layer of the royal archive. The readable text includes only scattered words: message sent, protection promised, must not forget, and what appears to be the beginning of a royal name. The rest is too damaged to decipher, but the tone suggests urgency and secrecy rather than routine administrative business. This fragment may represent the last document placed in the archive before it was burned, a final message whose content was deemed too sensitive to preserve but too important to discard without recording. If so, it hints at communications that were happening even as the empire prepared for its own destruction, negotiations or arrangements that required absolute secrecy. The possibility emerges that Hattusa's destruction was not the result of external invasion, but of internal calculation. Faced with the choice between allowing the empire's secrets to fall into the hands of rebels, rivals, or foreign enemies, the remaining loyal officials may have chosen to destroy everything that could compromise future operations or reveal past arrangements. This would explain the careful, methodical nature of the burning. It would account for the absence of defensive preparations or final military dispatches. Most importantly, it would clarify why the destruction was so complete and why no contemporary accounts of the event survive anywhere in the ancient world. If the Hittite Empire had indeed destroyed its own archives as part of a planned dissolution, it would represent something unprecedented in Bronze Age politics. A civilization that chose controlled demolition over chaotic collapse, that preferred to erase its own memory rather than risk having its secrets discovered by successors. They may have been among the first to recognize that adaptation required destruction, that some things must be forgotten for others to survive. Consider the broader pattern of destructions across the Bronze Age world. Most sites show evidence of surprise attacks, desperate last stands, and chaotic abandonment. But Hattusa's destruction has none of these characteristics. Instead, it shows the hallmarks of a planned operation carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. This raises uncomfortable questions about other Bronze Age destructions. How many were really the work of mysterious sea peoples, and how many might have been the calculated decisions of elites who chose to destroy their own societies rather than see them transformed by forces beyond their control? The evidence from Hattusa suggests that at least some Bronze Age leaders understood what was happening to their world and made conscious choices about how to respond. Rather than fighting hopeless battles against inevitable change, they may have chosen to demolish the old order themselves, ensuring that certain secrets died with the flames and that the future would be built on the ashes of a carefully curated past. The Bronze Age collapse may not have been simply a disaster that befell ancient civilizations. It may have been, at least in part, a solution that some of those civilizations chose for themselves. The question that lingers in the ash-filled rooms of Hattusa is whether they were wise to make that choice, or whether they destroyed something that the world can never afford to lose again. The Hittites weren't the only civilization whose final testimony was lost to strategic forgetting. In the dim light of a museum display case, fragments of clay tablets lie arranged like pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete. The Linear B script etched into their surfaces speaks of mundane concerns: barley rations, wine deliveries, worker assignments, bronze allocations. The bureaucratic heartbeat of Mycenaean, a civilization that once controlled the Aegean world. But nowhere among these thousands of administrative fragments is there a single word about the end. The Mycenaean world, which had documented every jar of oil and every bronze spearhead for centuries, fell silent about its own destruction as completely as if it had never existed at all. How does an entire civilization simply forget to record its own death? For over 4 centuries, the palace scribes of Mycenaean Greece had maintained one of the ancient world's most detailed bureaucratic systems. From the great citadel of Pylos in the west to the fortress of Tiryns in the east, professional administrators used Linear B script to track every aspect of palace life. They recorded religious festivals, military equipment, land tenure arrangements, and craft production with obsessive precision. The tablets reveal a sophisticated world of regional kingdoms connected by trade, diplomacy, and shared cultural traditions. Palace archives document contacts with distant lands: Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, Sicily. They preserve the names of gods who would later appear in classical Greek religion, the titles of officials who managed complex administrative hierarchies, and the detailed records of economic activities that sustained Bronze Age prosperity. These weren't simple tribal societies keeping basic accounts. The Linear B tablets show evidence of advanced mathematical concepts, complex legal relationships, and administrative systems that could coordinate activities across entire regions. The Mycenaean scribes who created these records were among the most literate and organized bureaucrats of the Bronze Age world. Yet around 1200 BC, this vast documentary tradition simply stopped. Not gradually, not partially, but with an abruptness that suggests something more than natural decline. The last Linear B tablets from Pylos break off in the middle of routine administrative business: a final entry recording wine for religious ceremonies, a list of bronze weapons being distributed to coastal watchers, an inventory of livestock that would never be completed. This silence becomes even more mysterious when compared to other Bronze Age civilizations. When Ugarit fell, its scribes left desperate letters pleading for help. When Hittite cities burned, their archives contained evidence of growing political tensions and environmental pressures. Even Egyptian records, despite their propagandistic nature, preserved detailed accounts of the crises that threatened the kingdom. But the Mycenaean collapse left behind no contemporary narrative, no explanation in the words of those who experienced it. The civilization that had been most meticulous about recording its administrative activities apparently chose not to document its most important historical moment. Yet traces of memory survived in forms that the palace scribes never used. The epic poetry that emerged from the Dark Age, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the lost poems of the epic cycle preserved distorted echoes of Mycenaean civilization's final generations. These works speak of heroes returning from a great war to find their kingdoms changed, of royal houses destroyed by divine curse, of cities abandoned because their rulers had offended the gods. The myths tell of Agamemnon murdered in his bath, of Odysseus finding his palace overrun by rivals, of Theseus exiled from Athens by popular uprising. They describe a world where traditional authority had broken down and where the old certainties no longer provided security. In the gaps between heroic adventure and divine intervention, these stories may preserve genuine memories of political collapse and social upheaval. But the mythological framework transforms historical events into moral lessons about pride, justice, and the relationship between mortals and gods. Instead of preserving the actual causes of Mycenaean civilization's collapse, The epic tradition created explanations that emphasized individual character flaws and divine punishment rather than systemic failures or external pressures. This transformation of history into mythology may not have been accidental. The communities that emerged from the Dark Age needed foundation stories that justified their own existence and explained why the old order had deserved to fall. By attributing the collapse to the moral failures of Bronze Age heroes, later Greeks could claim that their own societies represented an improvement over the past, rather than a diminished remnant of former greatness. Archaeological evidence reveals the physical reality behind these mythological transformations. The great Mycenaean palaces were indeed destroyed around 1200 BC. Pylos burned so completely that its Linear B tablets were baked into permanent preservation. Tyre shows evidence of violent destruction and hasty abandonment, and Thebes bears the marks of deliberate demolition. These destructions weren't uniform or simultaneous. Some sites were abandoned peacefully, others show evidence of earthquake damage, and still others appear to have been destroyed by warfare. The picture that emerges is one of complex regional variation rather than a single catastrophic event that explains everything. Most importantly, Mycenaean civilization didn't disappear entirely with the fall of the palaces. Many settlements continued to be occupied, often by people who maintained simplified versions of Mycenaean cultural traditions. The population didn't vanish. It reorganized itself along different lines that no longer required the complex administrative systems that had produced Linear B records. This continuity makes the disappearance of writing even more puzzling. If substantial populations survived the collapse and maintained some aspects of Mycenaean culture, why did they completely abandon the literacy that had been such an important part of palace life? Linear B wasn't just used for administrative record keeping, it was also employed for religious inscriptions, property markers, and personal names on pottery. The answer may lie in the nature of Bronze Age literacy itself. Unlike modern writing systems which serve multiple social functions, Linear B appears to have been primarily a tool of palace administration. The scribes who used it were professional specialists trained to serve the needs of centralized bureaucracies. When it collapsed, the social institutions that had supported literacy disappeared with them. But there may have been more deliberate factors at work as well. The Linear B tablets document a world of sharp social hierarchies, complex tribute obligations, and centralized resource control that may have been deeply unpopular with the people who actually supported it through their labor. When the palaces fell, the communities that survived might have had good reasons for wanting to forget the administrative systems that had recorded their exploitation. Destroying the records would have served multiple purposes. It would have eliminated evidence of debt obligations and tributary relationships that new communities preferred not to honor. It would have erased documentation of property claims and legal arrangements that no longer served anyone's interests. Most importantly, it would have cleared space for new forms of social organization that didn't depend on the complex hierarchies preserved in Linear B archives. The tablet that lies in the museum case today bears witness to this deliberate forgetting. Its final entry, whiny for ceremony, 1 amphora, breaks off in the middle of a routine administrative task as if the scribe had simply put down his stylus and walked away. But the break is too clean, too complete to be accidental. Someone made a decision that these records were no longer worth maintaining. In the silence that followed, the Mycenaean world passed into the realm of myth and legend. The heroes who had once been historical figures became characters in epic poetry. The political struggles that had shaped Bronze Age history became moral fables about divine justice. Standing before these fragmentary records in the museum's artificial light, the visitor confronts one of history's most successful acts of organized forgetting. Whether this was a conscious decision by the civilization's final administrators or a systematic effort by their successors to erase inconvenient evidence, the result was the same: the transformation of history into mythology. The wind that stirs through the museum halls carries the whisper of pages that were never written, stories that were never told, records that were deliberately left incomplete. In the gaps between the last Linear B tablet and the first Greek alphabet lies one of humanity's most profound mysteries: the silence that societies create when they choose to forget rather than remember. Perhaps the Mycenaeans understood something about the relationship between memory and power that we are only beginning to grasp. By refusing to record their own collapse, they denied future generations the ability to learn from their specific failures, but they also freed their descendants to create new identities unconstrained by the detailed documentation of past mistakes. The clay tablets guard their secrets still, witnesses to the moment when an entire civilization chose silence over history, mythology over documentation, and the freedom of forgetting over the burden of remembering what had actually happened when their world came to an end. While empires worked to erase their own records, ships quietly forged an unofficial flow of wealth across the Mediterranean, remaining entirely off the books. 50 feet beneath the azure waters off the Turkish coast, a ship lay sleeping in the darkness, its wooden hull black with age. When divers first glimpsed it in 1982, they found themselves staring at something impossible. A vessel loaded with goods from every corner of the Bronze Age world traversed the Mediterranean just as civilization was collapsing all around it. The ship stretched across the seafloor like a museum of lost wonders. Copper ingots gleamed dully in the diving lights, hundreds of them, each bearing the mark of distant Cyprus. Bars of tin lay stacked like silver bones, precious metal that had journeyed thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan. Elephant ivory tusks curved through the water, while gold jewelry that had dazzled Bronze Age kings. But perhaps most extraordinary of all was the sheer variety of the cargo. Here was amber from the Baltic forests, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Central Asia, ostrich eggs from Africa, cedar logs from Lebanon, glass beads from Mesopotamia mingled with Aegean pottery. Cypriot copper lay beside Mycenaean weapons. It was as if someone had gathered treasures from every civilization in the known world and loaded them onto a single vessel. Who could command such wealth? What power could assemble cargo worth more than most kingdoms possessed in their royal treasuries? As archaeologists carefully mapped the wreck over the following decade, the magnitude of what they were discovering became clear. 10 tons of copper cast into ingots, each one bearing the distinctive four-handled form that had become the standard currency of Bronze Age trade. Analysis revealed the metal's origins in the rich mines of Cyprus, mixed with tin, created the bronze that gave the age its name. But tin was rarer still, and the Uluburun ship carried enough to transform all that copper into bronze that gave the age its name. The sources were exotic beyond imagination. Some from the distant Taurus Mountains, others from mines so far away that their exact locations remain debated by scholars today. Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, perhaps even Cornwall, at the edge of the known world. Elephant ivory comes from African elephants, while hippopotamus ivory comes from the upper Nile swamps. These weren't random trade goods, but carefully selected luxury items, the kind of exotic materials that kings exchanged as diplomatic gifts or offered to gods in the most sacred temples. Yet for all its magnificence, the ship's very existence posed a troubling question. This floating treasury had been sailing the Mediterranean around 1300 BC, precisely during the period when the Bronze Age world was beginning to fracture. The great powers were already showing signs of stress. Trade routes were becoming dangerous. Political alliances were shifting like sand. What manner of merchant could operate in such an environment? What authority could guarantee safe passage for a vessel carrying enough wealth to buy entire cities? The answers should have been preserved in royal archives, recorded in the diplomatic correspondence that flowed between Bronze Age courts. The movement of so much wealth across the sea should have left traces in the bureaucratic records that ancient civilizations maintained so carefully. But when scholars searched through thousands of surviving tablets and papyri from the period, they found no mention of the Uluburun ship or its extraordinary cargo. It was as if the ship had never existed, at least not in any official capacity. The fact that such massive quantities of precious materials could move across the sea without leaving any trace in official records suggested something beyond normal commercial activity. The ship itself provided few clues to its origins or ownership. Unlike royal vessels, which carried elaborate decorations and official insignia, the Uluburun ship was built for efficiency rather than display. Its design borrowed elements from multiple maritime traditions: Canaanite construction techniques, Aegean rigging innovations, Cypriot cargo handling methods. It was a hybrid vessel created by people who understood shipbuilding traditions from across the Mediterranean world. The crew's possessions reinforced this impression of cultural mixing. Weapons showing influence from multiple military traditions, religious objects that blended iconography from different pantheons. Even the ship's anchor was cast in a style that had no clear cultural origin, as if its makers had deliberately avoided identifying themselves with any particular kingdom or people. As the excavation continued, a disturbing picture began to emerge. This wasn't a normal merchant vessel operating under the protection of Bronze Age authorities. It was something else entirely, a shadow ship sailing outside the official trade networks, carrying wealth that existed in no royal inventory, crewed by people who preferred to leave no traces of their passage. But if the ship operated outside normal channels, how had it acquired such extraordinary cargo? The materials it carried weren't random trade goods, but the specific raw materials that formed the foundation of Bronze Age power. Copper and tin were strategic resources controlled by kingdoms and empires. Gold and silver were royal prerogatives. Ivory and exotic stones were diplomatic currencies. The only way to assemble such a cargo would be through connections that transcended normal political boundaries, a network that could operate across multiple kingdoms simultaneously, that commanded loyalty from merchants and officials in every major Bronze Age power that had access to resources supposedly controlled by royal monopolies. Such a network would have represented a parallel power structure, invisible to official historians, but wielding influence that could rival the openly acknowledged authorities. Its ships would sail unrecorded through waters supposedly controlled by royal navies. Its wealth would accumulate in treasuries that appeared in no official accounts. The implications were staggering. If such networks existed during the Bronze Age collapse, they would have been positioned to profit from the chaos, while official authorities struggled to maintain control. As traditional trade routes broke down and royal powers weakened, shadow operators could step in to fill the vacuum, accumulating power and resources while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. But the Uluburun ship never reached its destination. Somewhere off the coast of southern Anatolia, it met with disaster. The circumstances of its sinking remain mysterious. No evidence of storm damage, no signs of accident or navigational error. The ship appears to have gone down suddenly, its cargo scattered but not looted, its crew vanished without trace. The manner of the sinking raises uncomfortable questions. Had the ship been intercepted by authorities who discovered its unofficial status? Had rival networks moved to eliminate competition? Or had the vessel's own operators decided that its cargo was too dangerous to deliver, too revealing of connections that needed to remain hidden? Whatever the cause, the ship's loss represented a catastrophe for someone, the destruction of wealth that would have been desperately needed as the Bronze Age world began its slide toward collapse. The copper and tin alone could have kept armies equipped for months. The gold and silver could have funded diplomatic initiatives or purchased loyalty from wavering allies. But there are no records of anyone mourning the ship's loss. No kingdom reported a missing trade expedition. Once again, the ship that had carried the wealth of the world vanished into historical silence as completely as it had vanished beneath the Mediterranean waves. This absence of official reaction is perhaps the most telling evidence of all. If the ship had been operating within normal channels, its loss would have created diplomatic incidents, insurance claims, investigations into the fate of royal property. The fact that it disappeared without generating any official response confirms that it was engaged in activities that the Bronze Age powers preferred not to acknowledge. As archaeology slowly reconstructed the ship's cargo and the circumstances of its voyage, a new picture of the Bronze Age collapse began to emerge. Alongside the traditional narrative of mysterious invaders and environmental crisis, another story became visible, a tale of shadow networks and unofficial channels, of wealth accumulating outside royal control, of power structures that operated beneath the surface of recorded history. These networks may have been symptoms of the collapse, or they may have been its cause. What had once been a world of royal monopolies and state-controlled commerce might have been gradually transformed into something resembling a black market economy, where wealth and power flowed through channels that left no official traces. The Uluburun ship provides a glimpse into this hidden world, a snapshot of wealth and power operating outside the systems that Bronze Age rulers thought they controlled. In the diving lights that illuminate the wreck today, the ship's treasures still gleam with ancient fire. It may be the questions the ship poses about the nature of power in the ancient world. How much of what we think we know about Bronze Age commerce and politics represents only the official surface of a much deeper reality? When the empires fell, did new powers rise from the shadows, powers that had been accumulating strength in the darkness, while official authorities focused on their public roles? In a world where so much was hidden beneath the surface, where power flowed through channels that left no official traces, the greatest mysteries were always meant to remain in the shadows. The raw materials that lay scattered on the Uluburun ship's deck had once been part of something larger, a circulatory system that pulsed across 3 continents, like the arteries carrying the lifeblood of civilization. From the distant mines of Afghanistan, precious tin journeyed west. From the island of Cyprus, ships laden with copper crossed the Mediterranean. In the royal armories of Hattusa and Memphis, Mycenaean and Babylon, the 2 metals merged in furnaces hot enough to forge the bronze that made empires possible. This was the circulatory system of the Bronze Age world. The metal network connected Cornwall to Crete, linked the Baltic to Babylon, made distant Afghanistan crucial to the survival of Egyptian pharaohs. But what happens when the heart of such a system simply stops beating? For over a millennium, Bronze Age civilization had depended on this delicate dance of metals. Bronze wasn't just a technology, but it was the foundation of power itself. Only bronze could create weapons hard enough to pierce armor, tools sharp enough to work efficiently, implements durable enough to last for generations. A kingdom without access to bronze was a kingdom living on borrowed time. The metal itself told the story of an interconnected world. Copper was relatively common, found in mines across the Mediterranean and beyond. But tin was different. Tin was precious, exotic, found in only a handful of locations across the known world. The primary sources lay impossibly far from the Bronze Age centers of power. Afghanistan's mountains yielded the finest tin, but getting it to Mediterranean workshops required a journey of 3,000 miles across deserts, rivers, and hostile territories. Smaller deposits existed in Anatolia and Iberia, but even these required complex trade networks to reach the major kingdoms. Britain, at the very edge of the known world, possessed tin deposits that some merchants were willing to risk their lives to reach. The logistics were staggering. A single bronze sword required copper from one continent and tin from another, brought together by merchants. Caravans crossed Central Asia, while ships island-hopped across the Mediterranean, all to ensure that Bronze Age kings could maintain their arsenals and their authority. The bronze economy was a house of cards built on a foundation of cooperation that spanned continents. If any major link in the chain broke, the consequences would ripple across the entire known world. And break it did. Archaeological evidence from across the Bronze Age world tells the same shocking story. Sometime around 1200 BC, the tin trade simply stopped. Not gradually, not partially, but completely. Mines that had operated for centuries suddenly went silent. Trade routes that had carried precious metal for generations became empty paths through wilderness. In Afghanistan, the mining settlements that had fed the Bronze Age world's hunger for tin were abandoned. Tools lay scattered in the tunnels where workers had dropped them. Smelting furnaces still contained the last batches of metal that would never be shipped west. The archaeological record suggests not gradual decline, but sudden, complete cessation of activity. Closer to the Mediterranean, the picture was equally dramatic. Anatolian tin mines that had supplied the Hittite Empire showed similar patterns of abrupt abandonment. In Iberia, mining operations that had connected Spain to Bronze Age trade networks simply stopped. Even in distant Cornwall, there's evidence that tin extraction ceased precisely during the period when Bronze Age civilization was collapsing. But perhaps most telling was the fate of the distribution networks, the great trading cities that had served as middlemen in the tin trade, Ugarit, Kanesh, and Komi, burned during the same narrow window of time. These weren't random attacks by raiders seeking immediate plunder. They were systematic destructions that eliminated the infrastructure necessary to maintain long-distance trade in strategic materials. Without tin, the Bronze Age world faced a technological crisis that threatened the very foundations of power. Existing bronze weapons could be reused and recycled, but creating new ones became impossible. Kings who had defined their authority through bronze ceremonial objects found themselves unable to commission new symbols of power. The shortage created cascading effects throughout Bronze Age society. Military effectiveness declined as armies struggled with inferior weapons. Construction projects slowed as bronze tools became too precious to risk in everyday work. As the bronze economy collapsed, alternatives were emerging. Iron, a metal that Bronze Age smiths had known about but largely ignored, began to appear more frequently in archaeological contexts. Unlike bronze, iron didn't require the complex international trade networks that had sustained the earlier technology. Iron ore was common, found in deposits scattered across most inhabited regions, but working iron required different skills, different tools, different social organization. The high temperatures needed to smelt iron demanded innovations in furnace design. The forging techniques were completely different from bronze working. Most importantly, iron production could be decentralized in ways that bronze never could be. A blacksmith with access to local iron ore could potentially meet all the metalworking needs of his community without depending on exotic imports. This technological shift created opportunities for groups that had been marginal during the Bronze Age. The Urnfield cultures of Central Europe, who had never been fully integrated into the bronze trade networks, proved remarkably adaptable to iron technology. The Sea Peoples, whatever their origins, seem to have embraced iron weapons earlier than many established powers. Even local tribal groups that had remained on the periphery of Bronze Age civilization found that iron technology offered them new possibilities for military and economic advancement. The transition wasn't immediate or uniform. For generations, iron weapons coexisted with recycled bronze ones. Some regions maintained bronze production longer than others. Certain specialized applications continued to favor bronze over iron. But the overall direction was clear: the Bronze Age was ending, and something new was beginning. Consider the strategic implications. Any group that understood the Bronze Age world's dependence on tin would have recognized that controlling or disrupting tin supplies could bring down entire civilizations without the need for massive military campaigns. A relatively small number of coordinated attacks on key mining sites and distribution centers could trigger a collapse that no Bronze Age army could prevent or reverse. The archaeological evidence suggests exactly this kind of targeted disruption. The tin mines weren't simply abandoned. Many show signs of deliberate destruction. The trading cities weren't just sacked. They were systematically burned in ways that eliminated their capacity to resume operations. The trade routes weren't just blocked. They were severed at precisely the points where repair would be most difficult. If such coordination existed, it would represent a level of strategic thinking unprecedented in Bronze Age warfare. Instead of attacking enemies directly, the architects of the tin shortage would have attacked the system that made Bronze Age civilization possible. Rather than conquering territories, they would have conquered resources. Instead of replacing Bronze Age powers, they would have forced those powers to adapt to a new technological reality. The identity of any such coordinators remains hidden in the archaeological shadows. But the beneficiaries are clear. Those groups that adapted most quickly to iron technology emerged as the dominant powers of the early Iron Age. The Germanic tribes that would eventually challenge Rome. The iron-working peoples of Anatolia who would build new kingdoms on the ruins of the Hittite Empire. The maritime networks that would eventually become the Phoenician trading empire. Were these groups simply fortunate to be positioned for the transition, or were they active agents in creating the crisis that destroyed their Bronze Age competitors? The question haunts every attempt to understand the collapse of the ancient world's first global economy. In the buried workshops of dead cities, archaeologists find the remnants of that final transition. The last bronze weapons were masterpieces of metallurgy, created by craftsmen who had perfected their art over centuries. The first iron weapons were rough, experimental, forged by smiths who were still learning their trade. But the iron weapons were the future, while the bronze ones represented a past that could never be recovered. The Bronze Age had ended not with a gradual decline, but with a sudden technological shift that changed the nature of power itself. Whether that shift was accidental or engineered, natural or artificial, remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. What is certain is that when the bronze world went dark, it did so completely and permanently. The global economy that had sustained civilization for over a millennium vanished in a few decades, leaving behind only questions and the glimmer of iron in the ashes of a forgotten age. In a world where bronze meant power and power meant survival, those who controlled the transition to iron controlled the future. The day the bronze world went dark may not have been a tragedy, but a revolution, one that succeeded so completely that its architects disappeared into the shadows they had helped create. At Medinet Habu Temple, when museum visitors study the reliefs showing Ramesses III's victory over mysterious seaborne invaders, a fundamental question echoes through the halls. Who were these sea peoples really? Raiders from unknown lands, refugees from destroyed civilizations, or the ghosts of a world that had already died, sailing in search of places that might remember their names? The Egyptian scribes gave them names that have echoed through scholarly debates for over a century: Sherdan, Ekwesh, Peliset, Teresh, Denyen, Cheka, Luka, Karkisha, and Weshesh. 9 peoples from the sea, according to Ramesses III's chroniclers, united in their determination to bring down the last great power of the Bronze Age world. But the Egyptian descriptions reveal something unexpected about these supposed raiders. Unlike the typical warrior bands that Bronze Age armies faced, the Sea Peoples came with families, ox carts, and household goods. The reliefs show not just soldiers, but entire communities on the move, men, women, children, elderly, all traveling together in what looks less like a military campaign and more like a massive migration. This wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was something unprecedented in Bronze Age warfare, entire peoples abandoning their homelands and seeking new places to live by force. The question that haunted Egyptian scribes and continues to puzzle modern scholars is simple. What could drive whole civilizations to pack up everything they owned and sail into the unknown? Across the eastern Mediterranean, in places where these sea peoples supposedly settled after their defeat, excavations reveal cultural artifacts that tell stories of remarkable diversity and unexpected connections. In the ruins of Philistine cities along the Levantine coast, archaeologists find pottery that matches styles from Mycenaean Greece, cooking vessels designed for foods that had never been prepared in Canaan, building techniques that echo Aegean architecture, burial customs that mirror practices from Cyprus and Crete. It's as if pieces of the destroyed Bronze Age world had washed ashore in the Levant and taken root in new soil. Even more intriguing are the connections that reach beyond the Aegean. Artifacts found in Sea Peoples settlements show links to Sardinia, Sicily, and even the distant shores of Atlantic Europe. Bronze figurines that match Sardinian styles, metalworking techniques that parallel developments in Central Europe, weapon designs that suggest familiarity with both Mediterranean and continental European military traditions. Recent genetic studies have added another layer to the mystery. DNA analysis of ancient remains from supposed Sea Peoples sites reveals ancestry patterns that span the Mediterranean world. Some individuals show clear connections to the Aegean islands, others display genetic signatures consistent with Anatolian origins. Still others carry markers suggesting ancestry from as far away as the western Mediterranean islands. This diversity suggests that the Sea Peoples weren't a single ethnic group, but rather a collection of displaced populations who had banded together for survival, all united not by common ancestry, but by common desperation. But the Egyptian records contain details that complicate even this explanation. The scribes noted that some of the Sea Peoples practiced circumcision, a custom that was foreign to Greek and most Anatolian cultures of the period. They describe fighting techniques and weapons that don't match what we know about Bronze Age Aegean warfare. Most puzzling of all, they record that these peoples counted their war dead in ways that were completely alien to Mediterranean military traditions. These details suggest that at least some elements of the Sea Peoples Confederation came from regions so remote that Egyptian scribes had no cultural framework for understanding them. Perhaps from the Black Sea region or North Africa, where different cultural traditions prevailed. Perhaps from Central European populations that had remained largely outside the Bronze Age world until crisis forced them to migrate south. The most disturbing aspect of the Sea Peoples mystery may be what happened to them after their supposed defeat by Rameses III. According to Egyptian propaganda, they were crushed decisively and either killed or enslaved. Yet archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The Peliset, identified by most scholars with the biblical Philistines, didn't disappear after their defeat. Instead, they established thriving cities along the Mediterranean coast and became one of the dominant cultural forces in the region for centuries. Their settlements show no signs of Egyptian occupation or control. Their material culture suggests not conquered refugees, but confident colonists building new lives in a new land. Other Sea Peoples groups show similar patterns of post-defeat prosperity. The Cheka established themselves at Dor, creating a hybrid culture that blended their own traditions with local Canaanite practices. The Danaan may have settled in Cilicia, where they eventually became ancestral to later Anatolian kingdoms. Even groups that supposedly vanished completely may have simply adopted new identities that allowed them to integrate into the post-Bronze Age world. This pattern of apparent defeat followed by successful settlement suggests that the Sea People's encounter with Egypt may have been more negotiation than conquest. Rather than destroying these displaced populations, Rameses III may have reached an accommodation with them, allowing them to settle in territory that Egypt claimed but couldn't effectively control in exchange for serving as a buffer against other threats. Such an arrangement would explain many of the puzzles surrounding the Sea Peoples. It would account for their rapid establishment of stable settlements immediately after their supposed defeat. It would clarify why Egyptian records continue to mention them as neighbors rather than enemies in later periods. Most importantly, it would explain why the great victory over the Sea Peoples seems to have solved Egypt's military problems, while simultaneously creating new regional powers that Egypt never attempted to challenge. But if this interpretation is correct, it raises even more disturbing questions about the nature of the Bronze Age collapse. Rather than mysterious invaders from unknown lands, the Sea Peoples may represent something more familiar. The displaced elites and populations of destroyed Bronze Age civilizations seeking new homes and new identities in a world that no longer had room for their old ones. Consider the timeline. The Sea Peoples' attacks on Egypt occur precisely when the Mycenaean world is burning, when Hittite cities are being abandoned, when trade networks across the eastern Mediterranean are collapsing. These weren't raiders from beyond the Bronze Age world. They were refugees from within it, the human debris of civilizational collapse seeking somewhere safe to rebuild their lives. This perspective transforms the Sea Peoples from mysterious outsiders into tragic insiders. People who had been part of the Bronze Age world but found themselves homeless when that world died. Mycenaean nobles whose palaces had been burned. Hittite administrators whose empire had vanished. Cypriot merchants whose trade routes had been severed. All forced to abandon their identities and create new ones from the fragments of their shattered world. The weapons they carried weren't exotic technologies from unknown lands, but the final products of Bronze Age metallurgy, superior iron weapons that some groups had developed as the bronze trade networks collapsed. The ships they sailed weren't alien vessels, but the latest innovations in Mediterranean shipbuilding created by people who understood the sea better than any land-based power could match. Most significantly, their military tactics weren't the primitive raids of barbarian tribes, but the sophisticated strategies of people who had been trained in Bronze Age warfare and had learned to adapt those techniques to new circumstances. They knew how to attack Bronze Age fortifications because they had once defended similar fortifications. They understood Bronze Age weaknesses because they had once relied on Bronze Age strengths. This interpretation explains why the Sea Peoples were so effective against established Bronze Age powers, despite apparently lacking the resources of major kingdoms. They weren't fighting as outsiders trying to break into the Bronze Age world. They were fighting as insiders who understood that world's vulnerabilities because they had once been part of it. But if the Sea Peoples were the displaced populations of the Bronze Age world, seeking new homes after their original civilizations collapsed, then what caused those original collapses? Were they also refugees from earlier disasters? And if so, who or what created the chain of destruction that eventually sent desperate populations sailing across the Mediterranean in search of anywhere that might accept them? The answer may lie in the pattern of destructions that preceded the Sea People's attacks. Bronze Age cities didn't fall randomly. They fell in sequences that suggest coordination. Trade networks didn't collapse accidentally. They were severed at points that maximized disruption. Populations didn't migrate spontaneously. They were driven from their homes by circumstances that left them no choice but to seek new lives elsewhere. If the Sea Peoples were the end result of this process rather than its cause, then their story becomes even more tragic. They weren't destroyers but the destroyed, not conquerors but refugees. As closing time approaches in the museum, the lights dim over the Medinet Habu reliefs. The carved warriors continue their eternal march, their horned helmets and feathered headdresses catching the last gleams of artificial illumination. But in the growing shadows, their faces seem less threatening and more haunted, the expressions of people who had lost everything they once knew and were trying to create something new from the ruins of their world. The Sea Peoples may have been the first refugees of global economic collapse, people whose world had ended not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow-motion implosion that eventually left them with no choice but to sail into the unknown and hope that somewhere, someone might have room for the survivors of a dead civilization. And across the Mediterranean, scattered traces of their passage remain, in the places they may have left behind. Morning mist clings to the hills of Sardinia, the Mediterranean island west of Italy, like memories that refuse to fade. Across the rolling landscape, ancient towers pierce the fog. Dozens of them, hundreds, massive stone structures called nuraghi that have stood sentinel over this Mediterranean island for over 3,000 years. They rise from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants, their cyclopean stones fitted together with a precision that still amazes engineers today. But the towers are empty now. They have been empty for centuries, perhaps millennia. The people who built them, who lived within their walls, they are gone, not destroyed, not conquered, simply absent, as if one day they decided that the monuments they had spent generations constructing were no longer worth inhabiting. Walking among these silent towers in the early morning light, a visitor might wonder what could cause an entire civilization to abandon the very structures that defined their identity. What could make a people walk away from monuments that had taken centuries to build, leaving them to weather and time like discarded toys? The mystery deepens when you examine what archaeologists have discovered about Sardinia during the crucial period around 1200 BC, when Bronze Age civilization was collapsing across the Mediterranean. Unlike other regions where populations declined dramatically and cities were destroyed, Sardinia shows no signs of demographic collapse. The island's population appears to have remained stable, even grown, during the very decades when the nuraghi were being abandoned. There are no evidence of siege warfare or systematic destruction, no mass graves indicating plague or famine. The people of Sardinia weren't driven from their towers by external disaster. They simply stopped using them. Archaeological deposits show that life continued on the island, but it continued differently, without the centralized authority and warrior culture that the nuraghi represented. It's as if the social architecture of Sardinian civilization had been dismantled as thoroughly as if the stone towers themselves had been pulled down, but the stones and the people remained. The nuraghi themselves provide clues to what was lost. These weren't simple defensive structures, but complex social centers that required sophisticated organization to build and maintain. Some incorporated multiple towers connected by walls and passages. Others featured elaborate internal chambers with precise acoustic properties. All demanded the kind of coordinated labor and advanced engineering that could only emerge from a highly organized society. The Bronze Age inhabitants of Sardinia who built these monuments were skilled metal workers, producing bronze figurines and weapons that rivaled anything created in the more famous civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean. They were accomplished sailors maintaining trade connections with Cyprus, Crete, and the Iberian Peninsula. They were sophisticated architects, creating stone constructions that have outlasted most of the wooden and mud brick buildings of their contemporaries. Yet sometime around 1200 BC, the archaeological record shows a dramatic change. Construction of new nuraghi ceased. Existing towers were gradually abandoned, though not destroyed. The elaborate bronze working that had characterized Sardinian culture became simpler, more utilitarian. The evidence for long-distance trade connections diminished significantly. Most tellingly, the warrior culture that seems to have dominated Bronze Age Sardinia simply vanished. The bronze figurines from earlier periods often depict armed men with distinctive weapons and armor. After 1200 BC, such military imagery becomes rare. It's as if the island's warrior elite had simply evaporated, leaving behind a population that continued to live on Sardinia but no longer organized itself around military hierarchies. Some scholars have proposed that this transformation reflects nothing more dramatic than economic and social change brought about by the broader collapse of Bronze Age trade networks. When long-distance commerce became unreliable, the argument goes, the elite who had grown rich from controlling that trade lost their power and resources. Unable to maintain their elaborate lifestyle and monuments, they were forced to abandon the nuraghi and integrate with the general population. This interpretation has the virtue of simplicity and aligns with what we know about social upheaval during periods of economic crisis. Throughout history, ruling classes have risen and fallen based on their ability to maintain the economic systems that sustained their authority. When those systems collapsed, the elites either adapted to new circumstances or disappeared from the historical record. But the Sardinian case presents puzzling details that complicate this straightforward explanation. The abandonment of the nuraghi was remarkably sudden and complete. If economic pressure had gradually undermined the warrior elite's power, we might expect to see signs of declining maintenance, partial abandonment, or conversion of the towers to other uses. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests that the nuraghi were actively abandoned all at once, as if their inhabitants had received orders to leave and never return. More intriguingly, recent archaeological discoveries have revealed connections between Bronze Age Sardinia and some of the most mysterious events in Mediterranean history. Bronze figurines found in Sardinian nuraghi display striking similarities to depictions of sea peoples in Egyptian reliefs. The horned helmets, the distinctive armor styles, the weapon types, all match iconography associated with the Trojan, one of the sea peoples groups that attacked Egypt during the reigns of Rameses II and Rameses III. The parallels extend beyond artistic representation to technological and cultural practices. Metalworking techniques developed in Sardinia appear in archaeological sites associated with sea peoples settlements in the Levant. Pottery styles that emerged on the island during the Bronze Age show up in Philistine cities along the Mediterranean coast. Even architectural elements from Sardinian nuraghi have been found incorporated into structures built by sea peoples groups in their new territories. These connections suggest a possibility that transforms our understanding of both Sardinian history and the broader Bronze Age collapse. What if the warrior elite who abandoned the nuraghi didn't simply disappear into the general population? What if they left Sardinia entirely, taking their military skills, their technology, and their cultural traditions to new homes across the Mediterranean? The timing aligns perfectly. The nuraghi were abandoned around 1200 BC, precisely when sea peoples groups were beginning their migrations and attacks on established Bronze Age powers. The cultural and technological similarities between Sardinian and sea peoples artifacts suggest not just distant trade connections but direct cultural transmission. The sudden, complete nature of the Nuragi abandonment fits with the idea of a mass departure rather than gradual social transformation. If this is correct, then the empty towers of Sardinia represent something unprecedented in Bronze Age history, an entire warrior class that chose migration over adaptation, abandonment over transformation. Faced with the collapse of the trade networks that had sustained their power, these Sardinian elites may have decided that their future lay not in clinging to their stone monuments, but in seeking new opportunities across the sea. Such a decision would have required remarkable foresight and organization. The logistics of moving entire populations, along with their portable wealth and technology, across hundreds of miles of open ocean would have challenged even the most sophisticated Bronze Age societies. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests that this is exactly what happened, not just once, but repeatedly, as different groups of sea peoples established themselves in new territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The implications extend far beyond Sardinia itself. If the island's warrior elite became the Sherden who fought for and against various Bronze Age powers, then the Sea Peoples phenomenon represents not the eruption of barbarian tribes from the periphery of civilization, but the redistribution of Bronze Age elites seeking new sources of power and influence. This perspective reframes the entire narrative of Bronze Age collapse. Instead of mysterious invaders destroying established civilizations, we see established civilizations adapting to crisis by abandoning fixed territories and transforming themselves into mobile warrior bands. The Sea Peoples weren't outsiders attacking the Bronze Age world. They were the Bronze Age world reorganizing itself for survival in changed circumstances. But this transformation came at a cost that extends beyond the political and economic upheaval it caused. When the Sardinian warrior elite abandoned their Nuragi, they left behind not just stone monuments but an entire way of life that had developed over centuries. The knowledge needed to build and maintain these complex structures was lost. The social institutions that had organized Bronze Age Sardinian society disappeared. Even the cultural memory of what the Nuragi had represented faded over time. The people who remained on Sardinia continued to live their lives, but they lived them differently. The island's culture became more localized, less connected to Mediterranean-wide developments. The sophisticated metallurgy and architecture that had characterized the Nuragi period gave way to simpler technologies and social organization. Sardinia remained inhabited, but it was no longer the same Sardinia that had built those magnificent towers. Evening light settles over the abandoned Nuragi, casting long shadows across the Sardinian landscape. The towers stand as they have for 3 millennia, monuments to ambitions and achievements that their builders' descendants can no longer fully comprehend. In the gathering dusk, they seem less like ruins than like puzzles. Stone questions posed by people who chose mobility over permanence, opportunity over tradition. Perhaps that choice was wise. The Sardinian warriors who may have become the Sherden survived the Bronze Age collapse by embracing it rather than resisting it. They found new homes, new roles, new identities in a world that no longer had room for the old certainties. Their empty towers mark not the end of their story, but its transformation into something larger and more complex than any single island could contain. The truth, like the morning mist that still clings to the Sardinian hills, remains elusive. What is certain is that the empty Nuragi continue to pose questions that echo across 3,000 years of Mediterranean history. They remind us that even the most stable societies can choose radical transformation over gradual adaptation. The warriors who walked away from these towers carried their world with them, but they left their monuments behind as markers of a crossroads where history turned in directions that no one could have predicted. Standing among them today, we can still feel the weight of that choice and wonder whether we would have had the courage to make it ourselves. The Sardinian warriors weren't the only ones forced to make impossible choices about what to preserve and what to abandon. At a peninsula in the eastern Mediterranean, other people were facing the same dilemma. In the archives of the Hittite capital, carved in cuneiform script on tablets that survive to this day, we find mention of a city called Wilusa. It was a vassal kingdom, the records tell us, bound by treaty to the great Hittite Empire. Its king bore the name Alexandu, which bears a striking resemblance to the Alexander that Homer would later call Paris, Prince of Troy. The tablets speak of conflicts between this Wilusa and kingdoms from across the sea, of diplomatic interventions and military aid, of a complex web of alliances that stretched across the Bronze Age world. But when Homer sang of the war at Troy, he told a different story entirely. In his account, the conflict was simple and clear. Greeks against Trojans, Europe against Asia, a heroic expedition to reclaim a stolen queen. There was no mention of the Hittite Empire, no acknowledgement of the vast political machinery that had dominated Anatolia, the peninsula where Troy itself was located, for centuries. It was as if an entire civilization had been edited out of history's most famous war story. Was this merely poetic license, the natural simplification that occurs when complex events become legendary tales, or was it something more deliberate, a systematic erasure that removed inconvenient truths from the cultural memory of the ancient world? The Hittite archives paint a picture of Bronze Age Anatolia that bears little resemblance to Homer's Troy. This was not a world of isolated city-states fighting personal grudges, but a sophisticated imperial system where the Hittite king maintained control over dozens of vassal kingdoms through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic marriages, and treaty obligations. Wilusa, or otherwise known as Troy, was one node in this network connected to the imperial capital at Hattusa by regular correspondence and mutual obligations. When conflicts arose with Mycenaean kingdoms from across the Aegean, the Hittite king was drawn into the disputes. When external enemies threatened the empire's western territories, the resources of the entire system could be mobilized for defense. The diplomatic correspondence reveals a world where no major conflict could remain purely local. When Mycenaean kingdoms attacked Hittite vassals, they were effectively challenging the empire itself. When Hittite forces intervened to protect their allies, they were asserting imperial prerogatives that had been recognized for centuries. What Homer presented as a personal war, fought over a beautiful woman, was actually part of a larger struggle between two imperial systems, the land-based Hittite Empire and the sea-based networks of Mycenaean Greece. Yet Homer's account contains no trace of this imperial context. The Trojans fight alone, aided only by exotic allies from the distant fringes of the known world. There is no mention of the sophisticated diplomatic apparatus that would have connected Troy to the broader Hittite system. No reference to the imperial armies that historical records suggest were operating in the region during the relevant period. More intriguingly, the timing of Troy's destruction coincides almost exactly with the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1180 BC. This wasn't coincidence, but consequence. Troy fell as part of the same wave of destruction that swept away the imperial system that had protected it for centuries. Yet Homer's account treats the fall of Troy as an isolated event, disconnected from the broader catastrophe that was reshaping the entire eastern Mediterranean. Why would such crucial context be removed from the story? The answer may lie in the circumstances under which the Homeric epics were composed. By the time these tales were being codified into the form we know today, the Hittite Empire had been gone for centuries. The complex imperial politics of the Bronze Age had given way to a simpler world of city-states and tribal kingdoms. For Greek audiences of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Hittite Empire was not just forgotten, it had never existed within their historical memory. Including reference to such a power would have made the story incomprehensible to listeners who had no cultural framework for understanding Bronze Age imperial politics. Better to simplify the narrative into terms that contemporary audiences could grasp. Greek heroes fighting foreign enemies in a world that resembled their own experience. But this editorial choice had profound consequences for how later generations would understand the past. By removing the Hittite Empire from the story, the Greeks transformed a complex imperial conflict into a simple tale of cultural confrontation. The nuanced politics of Bronze Age diplomacy became a straightforward morality play about courage and betrayal. More significantly, the erasure of the Hittite role in the Trojan War may have been part of a broader pattern of historical revision that reshaped Greek cultural memory after the Bronze Age collapse. The Greeks who composed the Homeric epics were not the direct descendants of the Mycenaean warriors they celebrated. They were the inheritors of a broken world, struggling to piece together fragments of a past they only dimly understood. In this context, simplifying the complex realities of Bronze Age politics may have served important psychological functions. Rather than confronting the disturbing possibility that their ancestors had been junior partners in someone else's imperial system, later Greeks could imagine them as independent heroes fighting their own wars for their own reasons. Instead of acknowledging that the Bronze Age world had been dominated by powers whose very names had been forgotten, they could create a past that felt familiar and comprehensible. Analysis of the destruction at Troy reveals multiple phases of conflict and rebuilding that don't align neatly with Homer's narrative of a single, decisive siege. The material culture shows continuous contact between Greek and Anatolian populations that persisted even during periods of apparent hostility. Most tellingly, the final destruction of the site occurs in a broader context of regional collapse that affected Hittite and Greek sites alike. This broader context suggests that the conflict remembered as the Trojan War may have been less a war of conquest than a symptom of systemic breakdown. As the Hittite Empire weakened and Mycenaean kingdoms faced their own internal crises, the carefully maintained balance of Bronze Age politics began to collapse. Local conflicts that might once have been resolved through diplomatic intervention escalated into destructive wars. Trade relationships that had enriched all parties deteriorated into piracy and raiding. Troy may have fallen not because Greek heroes were determined to reclaim Helen, but because the imperial system that had protected it for centuries was no longer capable of maintaining order. The Mycenaean expedition that Homer celebrated may have been less a glorious adventure than a desperate attempt to secure resources and territory as traditional sources of wealth and stability disappeared. But acknowledging this interpretation would have required later Greeks to confront uncomfortable truths about their own past. It would have meant admitting that their ancestors had been part of a world system that had failed catastrophically. It would have forced them to acknowledge that the Bronze Age collapse had reduced proud kingdoms to struggling survivors fighting over the scraps of a more sophisticated civilization. Instead, the Homeric epics offered a more palatable alternative. By focusing on individual heroism rather than systemic failure, they created a version of the past that could inspire rather than demoralize. The Greeks became victorious heroes rather than traumatized survivors. The Trojans became worthy enemies rather than fellow victims of civilizational collapse. The cost of this transformation was the historical reality of the Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire vanished from cultural memory so completely that when archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century, scholars initially refused to believe that such a power could have existed without leaving traces in classical literature. Perhaps most significantly, the systemic causes of Bronze Age collapse disappeared from the historical record. Instead of analyzing the economic, environmental, and political factors that had brought down multiple civilizations simultaneously, later generations focused on individual conflicts and isolated catastrophes. The possibility that the Bronze Age world had been destroyed not by external enemies, but by the internal contradictions of its own systems, became unthinkable. In the study rooms of modern universities, scholars place Hittite tablets beside worn copies of the Iliad, Homer's epic poem, trying to reconstruct the historical events that lie behind both accounts. The cuneiform records speak of imperial politics and diplomatic correspondence. The Greek epic sings of individual heroism and personal tragedy. Both tell truths, but they are different kinds of truth. One historical, the other mythological. The gap between them reveals the magnitude of what was lost when the Bronze Age world collapsed. It wasn't just cities and kingdoms that disappeared, but entire ways of understanding politics, diplomacy, and international relations. In this light, Homer's silence about the Hittite Empire becomes more than mere poetic choice. It represents the amnesia that necessarily follows civilizational collapse, the forgetting that allows survivors to create new identities from the fragments of destroyed worlds. The Trojan War, as Homer tells it, is not just a story about Bronze Age conflict, but a myth about how societies rebuild their sense of purpose after everything they once knew has been swept away. But myths, however necessary they may be for psychological survival, are poor guides to historical truth. By treating the Homeric account as historical fact rather than cultural memory, later generations lost access to the complex realities of Bronze Age politics. They inherited a simplified past that prepared them poorly for understanding the sophisticated challenges of maintaining civilization in a dangerous world. As evening light fades over the archaeological sites where Troy and Hattusa once stood, the shadows lengthen across ruins that tell different stories than the ones preserved in literature. The question that haunts these ruins is not just what happened to the Hittite Empire, but what happens to truth when the witnesses disappear and only the storytellers remain. How many other empires have been erased from cultural memory? How many other complex realities have been simplified into myths that serve the needs of later generations better than they serve the cause of historical understanding? The Trojan War may be history's most famous example of selective memory, but it is unlikely to be unique. In every age, those who survive catastrophe must choose what to remember and what to forget. The stories they tell become the foundation for future understanding, but they also become barriers to recognizing truths that no longer serve contemporary needs. Homer gave the Greeks heroes they could admire and enemies they could understand. But in doing so, he may have deprived them, and us, of the more complex truth about how civilizations rise, fall, and transform themselves in the face of challenges that exceed their capacity to respond. The price of that gift continues to shape how we think about war, politics, and the fragility of the worlds we build. In the meticulous records of Ramesses III, carved into stone at Medinet Habu for eternity to witness, appears a single mention of a people called the Weshesh. They are listed among the confederation of sea peoples who attacked Egypt in 1177 BC, one name in a catalogue of enemies that the pharaoh claimed to have defeated in glorious battle. The hieroglyphs give them the same weight as the Peliset, the Denian, the Checker, all those foreign peoples who came from the sea to challenge the might of Egypt. But after that single appearance in the royal propaganda, the Weshesh disappear completely from the historical record. No other Egyptian text mentions them. It is as if the name was written once and then deliberately forgotten, erased from memory as thoroughly as if it had never existed at all. Such complete disappearance might seem unremarkable. After all, many small groups from the ancient world left only fragmentary traces in the surviving sources. But the Weshesh were not alone in their vanishing. Across the records of the Bronze Age collapse, names appear briefly and then fade into oblivion with a consistency that begins to feel less like accident and more like intention. Archaeological investigations across the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean have revealed traces of what these vanishing peoples may have become. In early Israelite settlements, in Philistine cities, in the cultural layers that mark the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age, excavators find artifacts that tell stories of remarkable cultural mixing, pottery styles that blend Aegean traditions with local techniques, burial customs that combine foreign practices with indigenous beliefs, weapon designs that show influences from multiple military traditions. These hybrid cultures emerged precisely in the regions where historical records suggest the Sea Peoples settled after their conflicts with Egypt. But the archaeological evidence reveals something more complex than simple conquest and assimilation. Instead, it shows the gradual emergence of new identities that incorporated elements from multiple cultural traditions, while creating something unprecedented in the ancient world. The tribe of Dan, according to biblical tradition, came from the sea and settled between the territories of other Israelite groups. Archaeological excavations in areas associated with Dan reveal material culture that shows striking similarities to artifacts found in Aegean contexts. The biblical narrative itself preserves hints of foreign origins. Samson, the great hero of the Danites, displays characteristics that echo other Mediterranean hero traditions rather than purely Levantine ones. Similarly, the tribe of Asher settled in coastal regions where archaeological evidence suggests contact with Sea Peoples groups. Their territory corresponds closely to areas where excavations have revealed the hybrid cultures that characterize post-Bronze Age collapsed settlements. The biblical genealogies that trace their ancestry may preserve distant memories of integration between indigenous populations and foreign settlers who brought new technologies and cultural practices. But if these connections are real, they point towards something more unsettling than simple cultural fusion. The biblical accounts present the 12 tribes of Israel as ancient kinship groups with roots that stretch back to the patriarchal period. Archaeological evidence suggests instead that at least some of these tribes may have been communities of mixed origin that formed during the chaos of Bronze Age collapse and were later assigned fictional genealogies that connected them to a unified national mythology. This pattern of identity transformation extends beyond the Israelite context. The Philistines, who are almost certainly connected to the Peliset mentioned in Egyptian records, established themselves as a dominant cultural force in the southern Levant. But within a few centuries, their distinctive material culture begins to merge with that of their neighbors. By the time of the classical period, the Philistines had been so thoroughly integrated into the regional population that their separate identity existed primarily in the hostile references of biblical texts. The Chardan, who fought both for and against various Bronze Age powers, seem to have vanished entirely from historical consciousness. Yet their name may survive in Sardinia, and their cultural influence may be traceable in the martial traditions that later characterized Mediterranean civilizations. Like the other Sea Peoples groups, they appear to have been absorbed into new political and cultural configurations that had no need to preserve memories of their original identities. This process of absorption and transformation might appear to be the natural result of cultural contact and demographic mixing. Throughout history, migrating populations have been assimilated into the societies they encountered, often losing their original identities within a few generations. The apparent disappearance of Sea Peoples groups could simply reflect the normal processes by which small communities are incorporated into larger political entities. But the patterns surrounding these disappearances suggest something more systematic. The timing is remarkably consistent. Most Sea Peoples groups vanish from historical consciousness during the same period when new political and religious identities were being constructed across the eastern Mediterranean. The geographical distribution follows clear boundaries that correspond to the territories of emerging Iron Age kingdoms and tribal confederations. Most tellingly, the replacement identities that appear in former Sea Peoples territories often claim ancient origins that predate the Bronze Age collapse entirely. These new identity claims require the systematic forgetting of more recent origins. Communities that may have formed through the mixing of indigenous populations with Sea Peoples, settlers needed to develop genealogies that connected them to older, more prestigious ancestries. Local traditions that preserved memories of foreign settlement had to be either suppressed or reinterpreted in ways that supported the new mythologies. The biblical accounts of Israelite origins provide perhaps the clearest example of this process. The 12-tribe system presents a neat genealogical structure that accounts for all of the diverse populations living in the land of Israel during the Iron Age. But archaeological evidence suggests that the actual process of community formation was far more complex and involved significant input from populations whose origins lay outside the traditional narrative framework. By creating a unified genealogical mythology that traced all Israelite groups back to common ancestors, the biblical authors effectively erased the diverse historical experiences that had actually shaped these communities. Sea Peoples settlers who may have formed the core of certain tribal groups were transformed into descendants of patriarchs whose stories were set in a much earlier period. Foreign cultural influences that could be clearly identified in the archaeological record were attributed to ancient practices that had supposedly been preserved from patriarchal times. Similar processes appear to have operated in other regions where Sea Peoples groups settled. The emergence of new political entities across the Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean was accompanied by the development of origin mythologies that emphasized autochthonous ancestry rather than recent migration and cultural mixing. Communities that archaeological evidence suggests were formed through the integration of multiple population groups developed traditions that claimed they had always lived in their territories and had always practiced their distinctive customs. These mythological reconstructions served important political functions. In a world where legitimacy often depended on claims to ancient territorial rights, recent settlement could be a source of vulnerability. Communities that could trace their presence back to time immemorial had stronger claims to their lands than those whose arrival could be dated to recent historical periods. By transforming Sea Peoples settlers into ancient tribal ancestors, Iron Age political entities strengthened their territorial claims while eliminating inconvenient evidence of recent demographic change. But the psychological functions of these identity transformations may have been even more important than their political utility. The Bronze Age collapse had been a traumatic experience that destroyed familiar political structures and cultural institutions across the Eastern Mediterranean. Survivors of that collapse faced the challenge of creating new identities and new forms of social organization in a world that no longer resembled the one their ancestors had known. In this context, mythologies that connected new communities to ancient roots may have provided essential psychological stability. Rather than acknowledging that they were living in a fundamentally different world that had been shaped by recent catastrophes, Iron Age populations could imagine that they were continuing traditions that stretched back to the very beginning of human settlement in their regions. The traumatic disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse could be minimized or forgotten entirely in favor of narratives that emphasize continuity and permanence. The cost of these psychological accommodations was the historical reality of the collapse period itself. The experiences of displacement, migration, cultural mixing, and community formation that had actually characterized the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age disappeared from cultural memory. The Sea Peoples, who had played such crucial roles in reshaping the demographic and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, were transformed into footnotes in Egyptian propaganda or absorbed into mythological genealogies that denied their historical significance. This systematic erasure extended beyond individual group identities to encompass the entire character of the Bronze Age collapse. By forgetting the foreign origins of many Iron Age communities, later generations lost access to crucial information about how societies respond to systemic crisis. The adaptive strategies that had enabled Bronze Age populations to survive civilizational collapse and create new forms of social organization were replaced by mythologies that made such adaptation appear unnecessary. In the archives of modern museums, fragments of inscriptions preserve the names that were once forgotten. Stone tablets bear witness to peoples whose identities were deliberately obscured by the political and religious movements that followed them. But these archaeological remnants can only hint at the complex processes of identity transformation that characterized the post-collapse period. The silence that surrounds the fate of the Weshesh and their fellow Sea Peoples groups reflects more than the normal gaps in ancient documentation. It represents the successful implementation of cultural amnesia on a scale that transformed the historical consciousness of entire regions. Names that had once carried political and cultural significance were systematically removed from memory in favor of genealogies that served the needs of new political arrangements. In the dim light of archive rooms, broken tablets preserve fragments of these lost names like archaeological whispers of erased histories. The hieroglyphs that once proclaimed the defeat of the Weshesh have outlasted the civilization that carved them, but the people themselves vanish into the darkness between recorded history and mythological memory. Perhaps they never truly disappeared at all. Perhaps they were simply forced to die on paper so that they could live again under different names, carrying their experiences and traditions into new communities that needed to forget their foreign origins in order to claim ancient legitimacy. When history moved into its Iron Age configurations, no one spoke the old names anymore. The tablets lie in darkness, their inscriptions waiting for light that may never come. In their broken surfaces and faded text lies the evidence of one of history's most successful cover-ups, the transformation of displaced populations into mythological ancestors, the conversion of recent migrants into ancient tribes, the systematic forgetting that allowed new worlds to emerge from the ruins of old ones. The Weshesh are gone, but somewhere in the genealogies and traditions of peoples who claimed more ancient origins, their descendants may still carry fragments of memories that their ancestors were once forced to abandon. The price of survival was the surrender of their names, but the essence of who they were may have found ways to persist in forms that we can no longer recognize. Throughout history, the question remains, how many other peoples have vanished not because they ceased to exist, but because history required them to become someone else entirely? In the climate-controlled silence of an archaeological archive, rows of wooden shelves stretch into shadow. They hold the fragments of vanished worlds. Broken tablets with cuneiform script, papyrus scraps bearing hieroglyphs, stone inscriptions in forgotten languages. But as you walk deeper into the collection following the chronological markers that organize thousands of years of human writing, something strange happens. The shelves begin to empty. Around 1150 BC, the written word simply stops. Not gradually, not partially, but with an abruptness that seems to defy explanation. Where once there had been diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms, administrative records from palace bureaucracies, religious texts from temple libraries, and commercial contracts from merchant archives, now there is almost nothing. The Mediterranean world, which had been documenting its activities for over a millennium, suddenly fell silent. For nearly 3 centuries, longer than the entire history of the United States, this silence persisted. Across regions that had once produced thousands of tablets per year, scribes stopped writing. In cities that had maintained libraries for generations, the practice of recording information simply ceased. Languages that had been written for centuries were relegated to oral tradition, their scripts forgotten as completely as if they had never existed. Historians have long called this the Dark Age of the ancient world, a period when civilization itself seemed to forget how to record its own existence. But standing among these empty archive shelves, a more disturbing question emerges. What if the darkness wasn't accidental? What if the silence was deliberate? The traditional explanation for the Dark Age has always emphasized collapse and catastrophe. The Bronze Age world had been destroyed by invasions, environmental disasters, and economic breakdown. The complex palace systems that had supported professional scribes and maintained extensive archives were gone. The international trade networks that had made literacy valuable for commercial purposes had been severed. The populations that survived were too busy struggling for basic survival to worry about maintaining written records. This narrative has the virtue of simplicity and aligns with much of what we know about the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological evidence clearly shows widespread destruction, abandonment, and demographic decline across the eastern Mediterranean. Many of the great cities that had been centers of literacy and learning were burned, abandoned, or drastically reduced in size. The social and economic systems that had sustained Bronze Age civilization did indeed collapse catastrophically. But other evidence complicates this straightforward explanation. Archaeological surveys reveal that while some regions experienced severe population decline, others maintained substantial settled populations throughout the Dark Age period. Material culture continued to develop in sophisticated ways, with new pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural innovations appearing during the supposed period of civilizational breakdown. Trade networks, while disrupted, were not completely severed. Exotic goods continued to move across the Mediterranean, suggesting that some form of organized economic activity persisted. Most puzzling of all, some regions that maintained the capability for writing simply chose not to use it. In the Levant, where alphabetic scripts had been developing for centuries, the knowledge of how to write clearly survived but was rarely employed. In Cyprus, where both local scripts and imported writing systems had been in use, literacy virtually disappeared despite archaeological evidence for continued prosperity and cultural sophistication. Even in Egypt, where the hieroglyphic tradition was most firmly established, written records become sparse and formulaic during this period. This pattern suggests something more complex than simple civilizational collapse. If populations had the knowledge and resources necessary for writing but chose not to write, then the silence of the Dark Age may represent a conscious decision rather than an inevitable consequence of catastrophe. But who would choose silence and why? The answer may lie in the nature of writing itself and the purposes it had served in Bronze Age society. Literacy in the ancient world was not a general skill, but a specialized technology controlled by elite groups: palace bureaucrats, temple priests, merchant families, and diplomatic officials. Writing served specific functions, recording legal contracts, preserving religious traditions, documenting administrative decisions and maintaining correspondence between political authorities. When the Bronze Age political systems collapsed, these functions became not just irrelevant, but potentially dangerous. Written records could document claims to territory, authority, or resources that new power structures might prefer to deny. Legal contracts could establish obligations that post-collapse societies were unable or unwilling to honor. Religious texts could preserve ideological frameworks that competing belief systems needed to replace. Diplomatic correspondence could reveal alliances and agreements that no longer served anyone's interests. For emerging authorities seeking to establish new forms of legitimacy, the extensive written records of the Bronze Age world may have represented obstacles rather than assets. The detailed documentation of the old order could undermine efforts to create new narratives about political authority, territorial rights, and cultural identity. Better to let those records fade into oblivion and start fresh with oral traditions that could be shaped to serve contemporary needs. This interpretation gains support from scattered evidence of deliberate destruction and suppression of written materials during the transition period. Archaeological excavations occasionally reveal caches of tablets that were gathered together and burned, often in contexts that suggest systematic rather than random destruction. Libraries that had been maintained for centuries show signs of having been methodically cleared out rather than simply abandoned. Even grave goods that might have included written materials seem to have been carefully edited to exclude texts that could have preserved inconvenient information. More subtly, the patterns of literacy revival when writing does begin to reappear suggest that the silence had served specific political functions. When alphabetic scripts finally emerged from the Dark Age to become the foundation of later Mediterranean writing systems, they carried with them new cultural and religious traditions that bore little resemblance to Bronze Age precedents. The epic poetry that preserved Greek cultural memory ignored or transformed Bronze Age realities almost beyond recognition. The historical traditions that emerged in the Levant created genealogies and narratives that obscured rather than illuminated the actual processes of community formation during the collapse period. These new literary traditions appeared to emerge from a clean slate, as if the societies that created them had no previous experience with writing or complex cultural development. The Bronze Age background that archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates was systematically ignored in favor of mythologies that claimed much more ancient or divine origins for cultural institutions and political authorities. Such wholesale historical revision would have been difficult or impossible if extensive Bronze Age written records had survived and remained accessible to later generations. The texts that Bronze Age scribes had produced with such care and preserved in such detail would have provided constant reminders of alternative versions of the past that competed with the new narratives that Iron Age societies were constructing. By allowing those texts to disappear during the Dark Age, emerging authorities eliminated potential challenges to their preferred versions of history. The mechanics of this elimination may have been surprisingly simple. Writing systems require institutional support to maintain, schools to train scribes, libraries to preserve texts, administrative systems that value written records, and cultural traditions that treat literacy as important. When Bronze Age institutions collapsed, these support systems disappeared with them. If new authorities chose not to recreate them immediately, literacy could vanish within a single generation. Once writing had been abandoned for even a few decades, the knowledge needed to read older texts would begin to fade. Cuneiform tablets would become meaningless marks on clay. Hieroglyphic inscriptions would lose their connection to spoken language. Linear B records would become decorative scratches on pottery sherds. The vast libraries of Bronze Age learning would become archaeological curiosities rather than accessible sources of information. By the time Iron Age societies were ready to redevelop literacy, they could do so on their own terms, creating writing systems and literary traditions that served their contemporary needs rather than preserving Bronze Age legacies. The silence of the Dark Age had effectively erased the textual memory of the ancient world, creating space for new cultures to define themselves without reference to inconvenient precedents. This interpretation transforms our understanding of the Dark Age from a period of civilizational failure to one of strategic cultural reconstruction. Rather than representing humanity's temporary loss of sophisticated capabilities, the silence may mark a deliberate choice to abandon certain forms of complexity in favor of different approaches to organizing society and preserving knowledge. If this interpretation is correct, then the Dark Age silence was one of history's most successful examples of large-scale memory management. By allowing writing to disappear for 3 centuries, Iron Age societies eliminated almost all direct textual evidence of how Bronze Age collapse had actually occurred and how new communities had formed in its aftermath. The traumatic realities of civilizational breakdown, the complex processes of demographic mixing and cultural adaptation, and the often violent struggles for resources and territory that characterized the transition period were all allowed to fade from accessible memory. When writing finally returned, it brought with it mythologies that made the post-Bronze Age world seem inevitable and natural rather than contingent and constructed. The societies that emerged from the Dark Age could claim ancient origins, divine mandates, and traditional authorities that had never actually existed in the forms their texts described. The silence had given them the freedom to invent pasts that served their present needs without contradiction from inconvenient historical records. In the archive room, the empty shelves extend into darkness like a physical manifestation of historical amnesia. Somewhere in that darkness lie the spaces where tablets once rested, where papyrus rolls once unrolled their secrets, where human voices once spoke across centuries through preserved words. The silence has weight here, pressing down on the few remaining fragments like the accumulated forgetting of entire civilizations. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is how complete this constructed silence has been. For over 2 millennia, scholars accepted the narrative that emerged from the Dark Age as historical fact rather than recognizing it as a carefully crafted alternative to Bronze Age memory. The mythologies that Iron Age societies created to replace Bronze Age records became the foundation stones of Western historical consciousness, shaping how we understand ancient politics, religion, and cultural development. Only now, as archaeological evidence accumulates and analytical techniques improve, are we beginning to glimpse the outlines of what was lost during those 3 centuries of deliberate silence. But even our most sophisticated efforts to reconstruct Bronze Age realities must work around the gap that the Dark Age created in the documentary record. We can identify what was forgotten, but we can never fully recover it. The empty shelves extend into shadow, holding only dust and the whisper of pages that were never written. In their silence lies both the record of history's most successful cover-up and a reminder that the past we think we know may be less discovered truth than constructed narrative, shaped by choices made in darkness by people who understood that controlling memory meant controlling the future. Standing here among the evidence of what was deliberately lost, the question becomes not just what happened during the Bronze Age collapse, but who decided what version of those events would be allowed to survive. The silence speaks louder than any tablet, telling us that sometimes the most important historical act is the decision of what not to remember. As the archive lights dim and shadows lengthen across the empty shelves, the absence itself becomes a kind of text. Illegible but undeniably present, marking the boundaries of what we are permitted to know about our own past. In that darkness, history continues to hide its secrets, and the silence that was built 3 millennia ago still shapes the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. In the quiet after the story ends, the archive shelves stretch into darkness once more. Dust settles on blank papyrus scrolls and broken clay tablets, returning to the silence that has held them for 3 millennia. We have followed the fragments wherever they led, from the desperate SOS tablets still waiting in Ugarit's kilns to the deliberately burned archives of Hattusa, from the Linear B records that stopped mid-sentence to the triumphant lies carved at Medinet Habu, the Trojan War that Homer sang stripped away an entire empire from its cast of characters. The sea peoples who terrorized Egypt simply vanished into new identities. Entire tribes like the Weshesh disappeared not because they died, but because history required them to become someone else entirely. And beneath it all, the 3 centuries of silence that followed, years when civilizations that still possessed the knowledge of writing chose not to use it, as if the very act of remembering had become too dangerous to risk. These fragments don't form a complete picture. They can't. Too much was deliberately destroyed, too much was carefully forgotten. But they point towards something that challenges our most basic assumptions about how history is made and preserved. What if the Bronze Age collapse wasn't simply a catastrophe that befell ancient civilizations? What if it was, at least in part, a solution that some of those civilizations chose for themselves? The evidence suggests that when the Bronze Age world ended, it didn't end randomly. Cities fell in sequences that followed political logic. Trade networks were severed at precisely the points where disruption would cause maximum damage. Archives were burned selectively, preserving some records while destroying others. Most tellingly, when new societies emerged from the Dark Age, they came equipped with mythologies that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate the actual processes of their formation. This wasn't accidental amnesia, this was curated forgetting, the deliberate cultivation of ignorance about inconvenient truths. As the last light fades across an ancient map, only scattered points of illumination remain: Egypt's surviving kingdom, a few small settlements that endured the transformation. The rest of the Bronze Age world has returned to darkness, taking its secrets with it. In that silence, we are left with questions that echo across 3 millennia. How much of what we call history is actually memory? How much of what we think we know about the past is really just the story that someone needed us to believe? The artifacts rest in their cases, holding their secrets still. The silence that was built 3,000 years ago continues to shape the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from.